Sarah's true story from Ohio. When her son called her useless, she rewrote everything. There are words that once spoken can never be taken back, and in one careless moment, David Harrison learned that truth the hardest way imaginable. In a quiet neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, a 72-year-old woman named Sarah sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at a legal document that would change her family forever. She had spent her entire life raising 3 children, burying a husband, stretching every dollar so her kids could have what she never did. But one phone call from her eldest son, David, shattered something inside her that no amount of love could repair. This is her story. And if you've ever loved someone so deeply that you lost yourself in the process, you already know how it begins. Sarah Margaret Harrison was born in the spring of 1951 in a small town just outside of Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and no one locked their doors at night. Her father drove a delivery truck for a local dairy. Her mother took in laundry and mending from neighbors to help make ends meet. They never had much, but what they had, they shared. And from her mother, Sarah learned a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life: that love isn't something you say. It's something you prove quietly, consistently, without ever expecting applause. She married young at just 19 to a man named Robert Harrison. Robert worked at a parts factory on the east side of Columbus, a steady man with calloused hands and a gentle voice. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't wealthy, but he showed up every single day, and for Sarah, that was more than enough. Together they bought a small 3-bedroom house with a chain-link fence and a garden out back where Sarah grew tomatoes and green beans every summer. It wasn't much by the world's standards, but to Sarah it was everything. While Robert worked the factory floor, Sarah held the household together. She cleaned houses on weekday mornings, waited tables at a diner 3 evenings a week, and took in alterations on the weekends, hemming pants and letting out seams for women in the neighborhood. Every dollar she earned went straight into the family. New shoes for the kids, school supplies, groceries. She never bought herself anything new if one of her children still needed something. And there were 3 of them. David came first, sharp, ambitious, always reaching for more. Then Karen, the middle child, soft-spoken and steady, the one who always kept peace when tempers flared. And finally Thomas, the youngest, born with a mild learning disability that required years of patience, extra tutoring, and countless meetings with teachers who didn't always understand him. Sarah fought for Thomas the way she fought for all her children, silently, fiercely, without hesitation. Then, when Sarah was 58, Robert collapsed on the factory floor one Tuesday afternoon. A massive heart attack. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. Just like that, the man she had built her entire world beside was no longer there. She was left with the house, a modest pension, and a small life insurance policy, not a fortune, but enough to live carefully if she was wise with it. But Sarah didn't spend it on herself. She never even considered it. Over the years, she used portions of that money to help each of her children when they needed it most. A down payment so David could buy his first home, the reception and flowers for Karen's wedding, tuition for Thomas's vocational training program so he could learn a trade and stand on his own 2 feet. She gave until there was almost nothing left to give, and she did it gladly, because that was who Sarah was. After Robert's death, she became the quiet anchor of the family. She was the one who hosted every Thanksgiving, who called on every birthday without fail, who sent cards with $10 bills tucked inside for the grandchildren. She never waited for her children to reach out first. She never complained about being lonely, even though the house felt enormous without Robert in it. She never asked for anything in return, not gratitude, not recognition, not even a phone call. She simply loved, in the only way she knew how, through action, through sacrifice, through showing up even when no one noticed. For years, Sarah believed that her sacrifices had built something unbreakable. She believed the family she had poured everything into would hold together no matter what, because that is what love does, it endures. But she was about to discover that the people she loved most had been keeping a painful truth from her, or worse, they simply hadn't noticed her at all. It was a Tuesday evening in November when everything between Sarah and her son David shattered beyond repair. The kind of cold, still evening where the sky turns dark before dinner and the quiet of an empty house presses in a little harder than usual. Sarah had been sitting in the living room, watching the light fade through the curtains, when she picked up the phone and dialed David's number. It was a simple call, the kind she had made hundreds of times before. Thanksgiving was just around the corner, and she wanted to know if David and his family would come to the house, the way they always had, the way they had done every single year since Robert passed. David answered on the fourth ring. She could hear it immediately, the tightness in his voice, the distracted half-sentences, the sound of a keyboard clicking in the background. He was at work, or thinking about work, or stressed about something he did not want to explain. Sarah asked her question gently. She mentioned the turkey, the pie she planned to bake, how she had already started thinking about what the grandchildren might like. David gave short answers. Maybe we'll see. I don't know yet, Mom. And then Sarah made the mistake of being honest. She told him she had been feeling lonely. She said the house was too quiet and that she wished the family would visit more often. Not just on holidays, but sometimes in between. She was not dramatic about it. She did not cry or raise her voice. She simply told the truth, the way a mother does when she trusts her child enough to be vulnerable. David snapped. He told her she was being dramatic, that she always did this, that every phone call turned into some kind of guilt trip, designed to make him feel like a terrible son. His voice was sharp and impatient, the voice of someone who had stopped seeing his mother as a person and had started seeing her as an obligation. And then he said it, the words that would carve themselves into Sarah's chest and never fully leave. You're useless, Mom. You just sit in that house doing nothing and expect us to drop everything for you. We have real lives. The line went silent. Sarah did not argue. She did not defend herself. She did not remind him of the down payment she had given him for his first house, or the nights she had stayed awake with his son Thomas when the boy was sick, and David was too exhausted to get out of bed. She did not mention the decades she had worn the same winter coat, year after year, so that her children could have new ones for school. She simply hung up the phone, placed it on the kitchen counter, and sat down. She sat there for 2 hours. She did not make dinner. She did not turn on the television. She did not call her daughter or a friend or anyone at all. She sat in the silence of her kitchen and let that single word useless replay over and over until it had touched every memory she held dear. Every sacrifice she had made now passed through the filter of that word, and each one came out looking different, smaller, invisible, as though none of it had ever mattered. The truth is, this phone call did not come out of nowhere. If Sarah had been willing to admit it to herself, she would have seen the signs building for years. David had been growing increasingly dismissive, canceling visits at the last minute, with excuses that barely held together, forgetting her birthday not once but twice, speaking to her in short, impatient sentences, as though every conversation was something to endure rather than enjoy. There had been moments when Sarah felt it, that quiet shift in the way her son looked at her, but she had explained it away. He's busy. He's under pressure. He doesn't mean it. Mothers are endlessly generous with their excuses for the people they love. But the phone call on that Tuesday evening was the moment the dam broke. It was not the first crack, but it was the one that let everything through. That night, Sarah did something she had never done before. She walked to the hallway, opened the old filing cabinet where she kept important documents, and pulled out her will. She carried it to the kitchen table, sat down with a pen, and began to read it slowly, carefully, as though seeing it for the first time. But she was not reading it as a mother dividing her love equally among her children. She was reading it as a woman who had finally decided to listen to her own worth. She did not change the will that night. That is important to understand. Sarah was not a woman who acted out of anger, and she was not about to start now. She placed the document back in the filing cabinet, closed the drawer, and went to bed, but she did not sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her, and she thought. She thought about what David had said. She thought about what she had allowed. And she thought about what her silence had been teaching her children all these years. 3 weeks passed, 3 quiet, heavy weeks in which Sarah moved through her daily routines, watering the plants, folding the laundry, heating soup she barely tasted while something deep inside her rearranged itself, piece by piece, like furniture being moved in a room no one could see. She did not call David. He did not call her. And in that silence, Sarah began to hear her own voice more clearly than she had in years. It was Margaret who helped her find the words for what she was feeling. Margaret Calloway, her oldest friend, a retired school teacher who lived 2 streets over, and who had known Sarah since they were both young mothers pushing strollers through the same park. Sarah called her one evening, and they talked for nearly 3 hours. She told Margaret everything: the phone call, the word useless, the will spread open on the kitchen table. Margaret listened the way only a lifelong friend can, without interrupting, without rushing to fix things. And then she said something that Sarah would carry with her through every decision that followed. A will isn't just about money, Sarah. It's your last voice. Make sure it says what you truly mean. your last voice. Sarah turned that phrase over in her mind for days. She realized that her current will did not say what she truly meant. It said what was expected. It said what was safe. It divided everything equally, as though love and effort and presence and absence all weighed the same on some invisible scale. But they did not. Sarah knew they did not. She had always known. She made an appointment with a local attorney named James Whitfield, a careful man with kind eyes and a quiet office on Maple Street. She sat across from him and explained her situation without tears, without drama, with the steady voice of a woman who had already done her grieving in private. The original will split everything equally among her 3 children, the house on Birch Lane, her savings, Robert's pension. She told Mr. Whitfield she wanted to change it. She reduced David's share significantly. Not to zero. She was not cruel, and she was not trying to erase him. She left him a symbolic amount, enough to say, I am still your mother, but also enough to say, I heard you, and I heard myself. She increased Thomas's share substantially. Thomas, her youngest, the one who had always been the quietest about his love but the loudest in his actions. Thomas mowed her lawn every other Saturday without being asked. Thomas called every Sunday, not out of obligation but out of genuine care. Thomas had driven 3 hours in a snowstorm last winter just to fix her leaking faucet because he did not want her worrying about it alone. Karen's share remained mostly the same. Karen had her own life, her own struggles, and Sarah respected the complicated distance between them. But Sarah added something the attorney had rarely seen in his years of practice. She wrote a personal letter to each of her 3 children, to be read alongside the will after she was gone. Not legal language, not cold provisions. Her own words in her own handwriting, explaining not just what each child received, but why. She spent more time on those 3 letters than on the legal documents themselves. She wrote and rewrote them at the kitchen table, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the pale light of early morning, choosing every word as carefully as if she were stitching a quilt she wanted to last beyond her. Sarah also added a clause that surprised even Mr. Whitfield. A portion of her estate would go to the local community center where Thomas volunteered on weekends, teaching woodworking to teenagers who needed somewhere to belong, and a small scholarship fund, modest but real, for children of single working mothers. Women like Sarah had once been, women who carried everything and were thanked for nothing. She was not punishing David. She needed that to be clear, and she wrote it plainly in his letter. She was, for the first time in her life, acknowledging a truth she had been too afraid to speak aloud, that love without respect is incomplete, that giving equally to those who show up and those who walk up, he teaches no one anything worth learning. She was not angry. She was awake. Sarah signed the new will on a cold December morning, with Mr. Whitfield and his assistant as witnesses. She drove home, placed the documents in the filing cabinet, and locked it. She told no one, not Thomas, not Karen, not Margaret, but silence, as families often learn, has a way of speaking louder than words, and the truth, like water beneath a frozen surface, would eventually find its way up. 14 months passed. 14 months of ordinary mornings and quiet evenings, of Sarah rebuilding herself one small decision at a time. She had not spoken of the will. She had not hinted at the letters. The filing cabinet stayed locked, and life moved forward the way it always does, slowly, unevenly, carrying its secrets beneath the surface like stones settled at the bottom of a river. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in February, Sarah collapsed in her kitchen. A minor stroke, the doctor said. Not life-threatening, but enough to blur her vision for a few hours, enough to steal the strength from her left hand, enough to land her in a hospital bed with monitors beeping softly beside her, enough to remind everyone, including Sarah herself, that time was not infinite, that the body keeps its own calendar, and it does not wait for families to finish their arguments. Thomas was there within the hour. He came straight from work, still wearing his boots, still smelling of sawdust and cold air. He sat beside her bed and held her hand and did not leave until the nurses made him. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that he brought her favorite blanket from home, the one with the frayed edge she refused to throw away. He read to her from the newspaper because she said the television gave her a headache. He did not ask about money. He did not ask about the house. He asked if she had eaten, and whether the pillows were comfortable, and if she wanted him to call Margaret. Karen arrived the following day, having driven in from Pennsylvania. She went to Sarah's house first to gather insurance documents, pajamas, her reading glasses. She opened the filing cabinet with the small key Sarah kept in the kitchen drawer. And there, beneath the insurance folder, she found the will, the new will. She read it carefully, the way Karen read everything, slowly, thoroughly, turning each page with steady hands. And then she found the letters, 3 envelopes, one for each of them. She read her own. She sat at Sarah's kitchen table for a long time afterwards, saying nothing to anyone. Then she called David. David's reaction was immediate, and it revealed everything. He did not ask about Sarah's condition. He did not ask which hospital she was in or whether she was stable. His first words were about the money. His first emotion was outrage, not grief, not concern, not the sharp panic of a son learning his mother had suffered a stroke. He was angry that he had been, as he put it, cut out, as though inheritance were a birthright that required nothing in return, as though showing up were optional but receiving were guaranteed. He drove to the hospital that evening. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring comfort. He walked into Sarah's room while she was still pale, still tethered to an IV line, still recovering from an event that could have taken her from this world entirely, and he demanded to know why. Sarah looked at him. She was tired, she was weak, but her eyes were clear, and her voice, though soft, did not waver. She said, "Because you told me I was useless, David, and I believed you for a while. But then I remembered everything I've done, and I decided that my last act on this earth would not be rewarding someone who doesn't see me." The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Thomas learned about the will change last, and only because Karen told him gently in the hallway outside Sarah's room. His reaction was not what anyone expected. There was no satisfaction, no quiet triumph. There was sadness, deep, heavy sadness that things had fractured this far. He went back into Sarah's room and told her simply that he did not care about the money. He never had. He just wanted her to come home. Karen, who had spent her entire life standing between her brothers, tried once more to broker peace. She suggested they all sit down together, talk it through, find some middle ground the way they always had. But this time, Sarah shook her head, and what she said next carried the weight of 73 years of smoothing things over, of swallowing her own needs, of choosing harmony over honesty. She said, "I have spent my whole life making peace, Karen. This time I am making a point." David left the hospital that afternoon without saying goodbye. He walked out the way he had walked in, thinking only of himself. He did not call, he did not write, he did not visit again for 3 months. The silence between Sarah and David stretched through winter and into spring. But life has a way of forcing reckonings that pride tries to postpone, and David's reckoning was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. At first, David told himself he was the victim. He told Linda, his wife, that his mother had lost her mind. He told his co-workers that family drama was eating him alive. He told himself over and over again that he had done nothing wrong, that Sarah was being manipulative, that the will change was an act of spite from a bitter old woman who had too much time on her hands and not enough sense left to see what she was doing. That anger lasted weeks. It burned hot and loud in the beginning slammed doors, bitter rants at the dinner table, long stretches of silence where he stewed in his own righteousness. But anger, when it has no refundation, eventually begins to crack. And what seeped through the cracks in David's was something far more uncomfortable than fury. It was reflection. And reflection, unlike anger, does not let you look away. It was Linda who forced the first honest moment. She had listened patiently for weeks, but one evening in late February, after David had spent another dinner complaining about his mother's betrayal, Linda set down her fork, looked him in the eye, and said something he was not prepared to hear. She said, "Your mother cleaned other people's houses so you could go to college, David. She gave us the down payment for this home we're standing in right now. She never once asked for it back. She never once held it over your head. And you called her useless. You told her she had nothing left to offer. You need to sit with that. You need to really sit with it." David did not respond. He pushed back from the table and went to the garage, where he sat alone for over an hour. But Linda's words did what they were meant to do. They unlocked a door he had sealed shut. And behind that door were memories he had spent years ignoring. He remembered the snowstorm during his senior year of college, how Sarah had driven 4 hours on icy roads just to be in the audience at his graduation, arriving with windshield wipers barely working and a thermos of coffee she had made at 3 a.m. He remembered the credit card debt he had racked up in his 20s, the one that had kept him awake at night with shame, and how it had quietly disappeared because Sarah had paid it off without ever mentioning it, without ever asking for a thank you. He remembered how she had always answered the phone on the first ring, no matter what time he called, no matter what she was doing, because her children's voices were never an interruption to her. They were the reason she kept going. He had taken a lifetime of devotion and compressed it into a single dismissive word: useless. And here is the part of this story that matters most, because it speaks to something far bigger than one family in Ohio. David was not a monster. He was not cruel by nature. He was an ordinary man who had fallen into an ordinary trap, one that catches more adult children than anyone wants to admit. When parents age, a subtle and painful reversal begins. The people who once carried you become the ones who need carrying. The voices that once held authority begin to tremble. And for many adult children, that transformation triggers not compassion, but discomfort. The guilt of not doing enough, of not calling enough, of not being present enough. That guilt does not always express itself as guilt. Sometimes it disguises itself as irritation. Sometimes it comes out as impatience. Sometimes it wears the mask of cruelty. And the person wearing it does not even recognize what they are doing until the damage is already done. David's failure was not extraordinary. It was devastatingly ordinary. And that is what made it cut so deep. By March, the anger had burned itself out entirely, and what remained was a hollow, aching awareness that he had wounded the one person who had never stopped loving him, even when he gave her every reason to. He began drafting text messages to Sarah that he never sent. He picked up the phone a dozen times and set it back down. Pride is a slower poison than anger, but it is just as deadly. Then one Saturday morning in April, David got in his car and drove to Sarah's house. He did not call ahead. He did not rehearse what he would say. He simply drove, the way you do when your body knows something your mind is still fighting. He parked in front of her house and sat on the porch steps for 10 minutes, staring at the flower beds she had always kept so carefully, noticing that a few of them had gone untended. When he finally knocked, his hands were shaking. Sarah opened the door. She looked at him the way only a mother can look at a child who has broken her heart with pain. Yes, but also with something undefeatable underneath it. David did not ask about the will. He did not mention money. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom, not because of the money, because I forgot who you are, and I forgot who you made me." Sarah stepped aside and let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had sat alone on that December night, rewriting her will by lamplight, and they talked for 4 hours. They talked about things they had never said out loud. They talked about his father. They talked about the years that had gone missing between them. They cried. They sat in silence. They drank coffee that went cold, and neither of them noticed. That conversation did not fix everything overnight. Some wounds take years to fully heal, and some scars remain as reminders of what was lost and what was nearly destroyed beyond repair. But what happened next showed that Sarah's decision had done exactly what she intended. It had made her family see her, truly see her, perhaps for the first time in years. Sarah did not change the will back. In the weeks that followed that long conversation at the kitchen table, Margaret asked her about it more than once. She asked gently, the way a good friend asks when she already suspects the answer, but wants to hear it spoken aloud. And Sarah considered it. She truly did. She lay awake some nights turning the question over in her mind, wondering if the reconciliation with David meant the document had served its purpose and could now be quietly undone. But in the end, she let it stand. She told Margaret one afternoon over tea, her voice calm and certain in a way it had not always been, "If I change it back, I'm telling David that words don't matter." And they do. They always have. She paused and looked out the window at the yard where her children had once played. That will is not a punishment. It is the truth of what happened, and the truth deserves to exist even when it is uncomfortable. And yet something did shift in the family, not because of the will itself, but because of everything the will had forced into the open. David began visiting every 2 weeks. He brought his children with him, so they could sit on their grandmother's living room floor and hear her stories, so they could know the woman who had shaped the man they called their father. Thomas continued his steady, quiet devotion to phone calls, the weekend repairs, the presence that had never wavered even when no one noticed it. Karen, who had always been the peacemaker, organized monthly family dinners at Sarah's house. She set the table with the good china and made sure every chair was filled. The family did not become perfect. They still argued. They still misunderstood each other. Old habits surfaced and had to be addressed with patience and sometimes with pain. But they became honest. And honesty, Sarah discovered, was more valuable than harmony. Harmony without truth is just silence wearing a pleasant mask. What her family built in those months was something rougher, something less polished, but it was real. And real was enough. If you step back and look at Sarah's story from a distance, you will see that it was never really about a will. It was never about money or property, or who received what percentage of an estate in rural Ohio. It was about a woman who spent 70 years being invisible in her own family, who cooked and cleaned and worried and sacrificed and waited, and who finally, in the quiet of a December night, chose to be seen. It was about the dangerous assumption so many families carry without examining it, that a parent's love is infinite and unconditional in a way that demands nothing in return, that a mother will always be there, always forgiving, always ready with open arms, no matter how many times those arms are pushed away or simply ignored. Sarah's story challenges that assumption. It asks a question that many of us would rather not face. What happens when the giver stops giving? Not out of cruelty, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, out of the quiet realization that love, even a mother's love, deserves to be met with something more than indifference. And so if you are listening to this and you have a parent who is still alive, still calling, still leaving voicemails you haven't returned, still hoping you will visit this weekend or next weekend or the weekend after that, do not wait for a legal document to remind you of their worth. Do not wait for a reading of a will in some attorney's office to understand what you had and what you lost. The most devastating inheritance is not money lost. It is time wasted. It is words left unspoken. It is a kitchen table with one empty chair where someone who loved you used to sit. Sarah said something to David during one of their later conversations, something Margaret overheard and never forgot. She said it simply, without drama, without raising her voice. She said, "I never wanted to teach you a lesson, David. I just wanted you to remember that I am still here, that I have always been here, and that being here for all of you was never useless. It was everything." That is what Sarah's decision ultimately taught her children. And it is what her story should teach all of us, that the cost of taking a parent's love for granted is not something you can calculate until it is too late to pay it back. That family is not a bond you inherit through blood and then neglect without consequence. It is something you earn, day after day, through respect, through attention, through the simple and sacred act of showing up. And if you are lucky enough to still have the chance, the time to begin is now.